Prices are rising at their fastest rate in more than 40 years. New figures show inflation is now 11.1%. The soaring cost of energy and food is behind the rise in inflation, which the Prime Minister has described as the enemy.
It makes people poorer, that's what inflation does, and it's the enemy that we need to face down. And I want to make sure that we do that, and we do it as quickly as possible.
Also in the programme this lunchtime, NATO now says the missile that killed 2 people in Poland was probably fired by Ukrainian air defences. We report from the scene.
We're very near to the Ukrainian border here, just about 10 miles away, and people living in this area had been concerned they would feel the impact of this war at some point.
The Deputy Prime Minister asks for an independent investigation after 2 formal complaints have been made against him about his behaviour. Donald Trump confirms he will run again for the White House in 2024.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
And it's third time lucky as NASA finally managed to launch their Artemis 1 rocket on a new mission to the moon.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, 4 days until the World Cup, new controversies in Qatar, claims of fake fans and camera crews accosted as England prepared to train for the first time.
Good afternoon. Prices are rising at their fastest rate for more than 40 years, with the soaring cost of energy and food largely responsible. The inflation rate has jumped to 11.1% in the year to October. That is up from 10.1% the previous month. And it puts more pressure on the Chancellor ahead of his autumn statement tomorrow, in which he's expected to announce tax rises and spending cuts. Here's our economics correspondent, Andy Verity.
At this environmentally friendly brewery and pub in Stroud in Gloucestershire, the raw ingredients aren't getting any cheaper.
You know, it wasn't long ago when the value of the pound really dropped, and overnight the prices went up 10-12%.
The devaluation of the pound in the past year means businesses have to pay more in pounds to buy goods priced in dollars or euros, from hops to oil and gas.
How much do you pay for a bag of these?
It varies anywhere between sort of 15 to 40 pounds a kilo. The biggest rise is power. Electricity has doubled over the last year. Gas has gone up at least by half. Our raw materials, so molten hops, cans, labels, they've gone up between 10 and 15%.
Global inflationary pressure is now coming home in higher wage costs as employers pay more to compete for an unexpectedly small pool of available workers.
Labour, we're a living wage employer. Our lowest wages have gone up by 10%. For us, that's at least sort of 40, 50, 60,000 pounds a year additional costs, which means we've got to sell somewhere between 150,000, 200,000 pounds worth more beer just to cover the additional wages costs.
But some global inflationary pressures have recently been easing. Shipping goods like beer across the world now cost less than a third of what it did in 2021. That's one reason why the Bank of England expects double-digit inflation to drop back to single digits in the spring. For now, though, it's all about those price shocks.
Milk, butter, dairy foods, bread.
Largely filling up the car.
Strangely, fruit teas, they seem to have gone from £1 to £2.25, and you think, how can that be?
Until recently, most of the inflationary pressure was global. The price of food, the price of fuel. There's not much the Bank of England can do about those global prices. But what they're now worried about is that inflation is becoming embedded domestically in the price of services, like a restaurant meal.
The UK is not the only country hit by soaring inflation. It's even higher in Germany and Italy, which depend far more on imported Russian gas.
What's people's number one anxiety at the moment? It's the rising cost of things. It's inflation. That's what's eating into people's living standards. The Chancellor rightly described it as insidious. It makes people poorer. That's what inflation does. And it's the enemy that we need to face down.
Well, we know that the Tories have crashed the economy, and then to make matters worse, families will be incredibly worried about rising inflation that we've seen announced today. It's already a really worrying time. Labour's plan will be to get our economy growing, and we'd be making different choices in the statement that's coming up in Parliament.
To stop inflation bedding down in the domestic economy, interest rates were expected after the mini-budget to have to rise to 6%. Now they're expected to peak in the spring at 4.5%. Much higher than a year ago, but lower than many economists feared. Andy Verity, BBC News, Stroud.
So, how are households coping with the spiralling cost of living? Well, our Consumer Affairs correspondent Coletta Smith has spent the morning in Gloucester talking to people there about how higher prices are affecting them.
If it felt like a never-ending tidal wave of price rises for your household, then you are not alone. It's been a long slog since we hit those record rates in January, and we've had month after month after month of new records. The country's top statisticians measure hundreds of items right across the economy every month and then put out a figure for how much the average price is going up by. This month, it's 11.1%, which is crazy. So what is going on?
Everywhere you go, and it's not going up 5 or 10 pence, it's going up a lot more than that in the pences. And the gas and the electric, I mean, we even cutting down on even using the heating at the moment. So what I want to know is, why is inflation going up so high?
This month's big price increase is because of the huge increase we saw in energy bills at the beginning of October. But it's not just households that are facing those prices, businesses are too, and they're passing on those costs to us as customers by upping all of their prices. The reason behind all of this is global gas and oil prices that have really been skyrocketing from the beginning of this year as we came out of the pandemic and then went straight into the war in Ukraine.
We was probably spending an extra £40 a week on a full shop, which is almost a couple of £100 a month. So what I wanted to know really was, when will prices start to fall again?
The Bank of England are hoping that by raising interest rates, they'll slow down inflation. We're also seeing global food prices start to fall, so that might give us a little bit of relief in the supermarkets. But it's worth remembering that even when inflation begins to slow down, that doesn't mean the prices will fall in the shops. They'll just be increasing by a little less.
Petrol. So I have to obviously drive the kids to and from school every day, so it's really, really expensive. So what I'd like to know is how we can beat inflation.
Most people have already been making those choices for months, cutting back on the luxuries in life, the coffees, the meals out, the takeaways, only using the car when you have to, cutting down on the energy usage in your house just to try and keep on top of those bills. Of course, a pay rise would help, but lots of economists think that that will mean businesses will put their prices up more to cover those wage bills. And if you're lucky enough to have some savings, don't forget that interest rates are going up. So those savings will be earning a little bit more. Coletta Smith, BBC News in Gloucester.
Well, back now to our economics correspondent Andy Verity, who's with me now. Andy, 11.1% inflation. That's a pretty grim backdrop ahead of tomorrow's autumn statement from the Chancellor.
It really is. The Bank of England had predicted it would peak at around 11%, so it's not expected in that regard, but it's happened sooner than most economists were expecting. The average forecast was for 10.7% this time round. It could possibly get even higher than 11.1. We just don't know how it's going to play out in the next few months. But the prediction is that it will fall next year, so it will drop back into single digits in the back half of next year. What we don't yet know that we need to learn tomorrow in the autumn statement is what kind of level of government support for households we're going to have after April. Because Jeremy Hunt has said he's not going to do the same level of support then that the Truss government was planning. We're expecting something a bit more targeted on poorer households, which may be appropriate given that the ONS just put out new figures today showing that they're experiencing a greater rate of inflation than better off households.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. NATO now says that the missile that killed 2 people yesterday in eastern Poland was probably fired by Ukrainian air defences rather than Russia. Moscow had already strongly denied that it was responsible for the rocket that hit the village of Peszczodów in the east of Poland near the border with Ukraine. Well, our correspondent Dan Johnson is close to the scene for us now. Dan.
Yes, what happened here yesterday had people here and around the world holding their breath because it could have potentially marked a serious step up, a serious escalation in this conflict. Now, there is today, to some degree, people breathing a sigh of relief. We're being told this was most likely an accident, not an intentional target. But nonetheless, lives were lost here, and people who live with the Ukrainian conflict right on their doorstep know now that the risks are real. Like this is where the war in Ukraine spilled over onto Polish turf and claimed Polish lives. 2 civilians were killed here in the explosion yesterday afternoon on this farm close to the border with Ukraine. The questions now are what landed here and who fired it. Jevren lives close by. He heard the explosion and says his family were really scared. He said one of those killed was a farmer. The other worked in the village shop. There's now a huge investigation involving Polish military experts who are assessing what caused this explosion and where it came from. This lunchtime, the Polish president said what happened here appeared to be an unfortunate accident and not an intentional attack. A statement echoed at NATO headquarters.
We have no indication that this was the result of a deliberate attack. And we have no indication that Russia is preparing offensive military actions against NATO.
More military teams are coming in to join the investigation, which is taking place at the farm just a few hundred metres up that road. This is as close as we're allowed to get, but we're very near to the Ukrainian border here, just about 10 miles away. And people living in this area had been concerned they would feel the impact of this war at some point. Russia attacked cities across Ukraine yesterday, including Lviv, just 40 miles from the Polish border. The Russians say it wasn't their missile that crossed into Poland. Ukraine does have Russian-made weapons as part of its air defences, but Ukraine's president was clear who he believes is responsible.
Russian missiles hit the territory of neighbouring Poland yesterday. There must be a quick reaction. This attack is a message from Russia to the G20 summit. So when I say it's really the G19, I'm not wrong, because Russia is a terrorist state and we are defending ourselves against it.
US President Joe Biden, who himself visited Poland earlier this year, questioned that.
It's unlikely in the minds of the trajectory that it was fired from Russia, but we'll see.
So political leaders in Poland and other countries are urging calm responses and careful next steps as the full details are confirmed. NATO is strengthening air defences across Eastern Europe as well as Ukraine because it's clear now to people here and elsewhere. As long as this conflict continues, there is a risk, even indirectly, of others being caught up in it. Dan Johnson, BBC News in Eastern Poland.
Well, our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams is with me now. So, Paul, we are getting a clearer picture of what happened.
Depends a little bit on who you ask, Ben, but yes, I think we are. Look, as Dan said, last night there was a real sense of dread that something that people had warned about for months as a result of Russia's invasion might finally have come to pass. Pretty quickly last night, experts started looking at the fragments of the missile involved. And it became fairly quickly apparent that this was likely not to have been part of a Russian cruise missile, but a Russian-made, but likely Ukrainian-fired air defense missile, an S-300. And that led them to believe that probably this was a fragment of a Ukrainian missile. Now, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, called that a Russian conspiracy theory. But overnight, we got this steady drip of other people lending their weight to this theory, notably Joe Biden, the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, saying there was no sign that this was part of a Russian attack, that it was likely a Ukrainian missile. As you just heard, the NATO Secretary General pretty much endorsing that view. Now, Ukrainian officials are still, up to now, saying they have contradictory evidence and they want to see what evidence NATO has before we draw any firm conclusions. But, you know, the context of this is the fact that for the last 8 months or so, Russia has been attacking Ukraine relentlessly. And Mr. Stoltenberg, in his press conference this morning, said this was not Ukraine's fault. Russia, he said, must stop this senseless war.
OK, Paul, thank you. Paul Adams reporting. The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, says he has asked for an independent investigation into 2 formal complaints that had been made against him about his behaviour. Mr Raab, who's also Deputy Prime Minister, says one complaint relates to his time as Foreign Secretary and one relates to a previous stint as Justice Secretary. He's rejected the allegation, saying he's never tolerated bullying. Number 10 says that an independent investigator has been appointed to establish the facts. Here's our political correspondent Ian Watson.
The Justice Secretary has asked for an investigation. This one, though, is rather unconventional. He's asked for an independent probe into his own conduct, following allegations in the media that he bullied staff. Asked about these allegations, this was the Prime Minister's line.
I don't recognise the characterisation of Dominic's behaviour personally, and I was not aware and am not aware of any formal complaints about that.
Today, all that changed. In a letter to the Prime Minister, Dominic Raab said, "I've just been notified that 2 separate complaints have been formally made against me for my time as Foreign Secretary and my first tenure as Justice Secretary. I'm writing to request that you commission an independent investigation into the claims as soon as possible." He goes on to say he's never tolerated bullying, but he was subjected to some robust questioning when he stood in at PMQs.
This morning, the Deputy Prime Minister finally acknowledged formal complaints about his misconduct. But his letter contains no hint of admission or apology. This is anti-bullying week. Will he apologise?
She asked about the complaints. I received notification this morning. I immediately asked the Prime Minister to set up an independent inquiry into them. I'm confident I behaved professionally throughout, but of course I will engage thoroughly and look forward, Mr Speaker, may I say, look forward to transparently addressing any claims that have been made.
The person who would have looked into any allegations, Lord Geidt, resigned as ethics advisor under Boris Johnson in June. The government hasn't yet replaced him, which has led civil service unions to question how an investigation would be conducted.
If a civil servant wanted to challenge the most senior official in their department, their permanent secretary, there's a clear procedure that lays out what is bullying, what's not. How will an investigation be conducted? How could they challenge that if they were unhappy with the outcome? There's none of that when it comes to ministers. All we have is some vague wording in the ministerial code, and everything else is essentially up to the Prime Minister to decide on a whim.
I've been told of concerns that some civil servants have about Dominic Raab's conduct, but I don't have any details of the formal complaints. But the danger for Downing Street is that the focus shifts away from the Justice Secretary and onto the Prime Minister's own judgment. Ian Watson, BBC News, Westminster.
Donald Trump has finally confirmed that he is running again for president in 2024. He made the announcement from his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida, claiming that America's comeback starts right now. But Mr Trump has found himself being blamed for the poor performance of the Republican Party at the recent midterm elections. Our North America correspondent Nomi Iqbal reports.
In front of his crowd, inside his home, Donald Trump officially announced his comeback.
America's comeback starts right now.
It was classic Trump. He painted America as a dystopia that only he could rescue.
Because this is not just a campaign. This is a quest to save our country. Talking about saving our country.
He boasted about his time in office.
Everybody was thriving like never before.
Had a go at President Biden.
Now we have a president who falls asleep at global conferences.
And hit out at the various legal investigations into him.
And I'm a victim, I will tell you. I'm a victim.
Many of Donald Trump's supporters were celebrating outside Mar-a-Lago when he made his announcement. He is hugely popular here in his home state. But given this was his big moment, his speech appeared low in energy. Many members of his own party are questioning whether his political influence is fading. Many Republicans blame him for their party's underwhelming performance in the midterm elections. Most of the candidates Mr. Trump publicly endorsed in crucial races lost. And his potential rival, 44-year-old Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, had this to say after being called average by Mr. Trump.
I think what you learn is all that's just noise. And really what matters is, are you leading? Are you getting in front of issues? Are you delivering results for people? And are you standing up for folks? And if you do that, then none of that stuff matters.
Donald Trump's announcement is a way for him to seize early momentum in the race. But there's a long way to go. And with his legal problems mounting, it may impact him both personally and politically. Nomia Iqbal, BBC News, Florida.
And the time is just 20 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. Prices are rising at their fastest rate in more than 40 years. New figures show inflation is now 11.1%. And coming up, problems with the supply of eggs are leading some shops to ration how many customers can buy.
Coming up on the BBC News Channel, 21-time Grand Slam champion Novak Djokovic is likely to bid for a 10th Australian Open title in the new year after the Australian government overturned his visa ban.
Well, it's been third time lucky for the US space agency NASA, which has finally managed to launch its Artemis rocket on a journey to the moon. Artemis will send an uncrewed capsule on a 26-day test trip around the moon, a first step to taking astronauts back to the lunar surface by 2025. Well, this morning's launch from Florida followed two previous attempts in August and September that were aborted during countdown because of technical problems. Our science editor, Rebecca Morell, is at Goonhilly Earth Station in Cornwall, which is tracking the rocket's progress. Rebecca.
Yeah, that's right. This huge dish behind me is receiving signals from the spacecraft right now. This mission has taken decades. It's involved thousands of people and it's cost billions. There have been 2 failed launch attempts, but today was the day we finally got to see this rocket fly, the start of a new age of space exploration.
It was the moment they'd been waiting for.
And here we go. 4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1. And liftoff of Artemis 1.
After months of setbacks, NASA's most powerful rocket was finally on its way. The start of humanity's return to the lunar surface.
We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
Took a long time coming to get here. Last time we were on the moon, Apollo 17, and we still have a long ways to go. And this is just the test flight.
But the run-up to launch wasn't without drama. During fuelling, a hydrogen leak was spotted, so a team was sent to the launch pad to repair it. Then, something unexpected.
They reported that they had an issue. That was actually a bad Ethernet switch.
A radar station, essential for tracking the rocket and destroying it if it veered off course, lost its signal. But a last-minute fix worked, and the rocket was on its way. No people are on board this time, but this test flight will show if it's safe for astronauts. The ultimate plan is to land the first woman and first person of colour on the moon.
I wanted to be an astronaut from the time that I was 5 years old, and you know, for anybody that has a dream or some kind of aspiration, if they see somebody that they can identify with a little bit, it puts them into a totally different perspective where they can say, well, wait a minute, that person was just like me and they did it, so I can do it too.
And in a remote part of Cornwall, the Goonhilly Earth Station has an important role to play.
This huge dish is part of a network of antennas that will be tracking the Orion spacecraft. This will help NASA to work out very precisely exactly where the spacecraft is and how fast it's moving as it heads to the moon.
And this was the moment the signal came through.
We have AOS on Orion, good carrier level.
This doesn't look like very much, I think, to most people, but to communication engineers, this is pure magic. What you would normally see is just a flat line of noise, but we're picking up this signal from space, from the Artemis spacecraft.
With a last look back at the Earth, the spacecraft now has a 26-day journey ahead. This is just the beginning, the start of a million-mile journey that's being described as Apollo for a new generation. Rebecca Morell, BBC News.
Asda and Lidl are limiting the number of eggs that customers can buy. There are industry-wide supply problems exacerbated by the recent outbreak of avian flu, which has led to hundreds of thousands of hens being culled. Well, our business correspondent Emma Simpson is with me now. Emma, how big a problem is this?
Clearly, there are some real
issues, and lots of shoppers will have been noticing gaps on the supermarket shelves for eggs. And I think there are a number of factors going on. You have free-range egg producers saying they're not making any money because of soaring costs for things like feed and energy, and some are either leaving the industry or pausing production. And avian flu has been kicking around the UK for the last few years, and that apparently has caused some producers to cut back. So we have a situation where the number of packed eggs fell by 10% in the last quarter, year on year. And the situation is being compounded by this really severe outbreak of avian flu, and that's now starting to be felt on the shelves. The retail industry body, the BRC, says supermarkets are working hard with suppliers to minimise the impact on customers. And as for the government, DEFRA saying that there isn't a shortage, that with 38 million hens, these problems aren't likely to affect overall supply, but that supply seems a lot tighter than it has been.
OK, Emma, thank you. The World Cup kicks off in Qatar this weekend, with attention focused on the country's human rights record. Qatari society has a strict interpretation of Islamic law and an ancient tribal system. Well, our religion editor, Lee Makboul, has been looking at what that means, in particular for women there and for the gay community.
Qatar wants to show off its fun-loving side ahead of the World Cup. Its modernity and its hospitality. This little country with huge oil and gas reserves was economically catapulted into the future. But underneath its bedrock remains cultural and religious traditionalism. It's difficult to speak to people freely without permission from the authorities, but these students in Doha's education city talked of their excitement.
It's definitely a marking of history for the Arabs, and we're all very proud. Especially as a Qatari, I'm very proud that my country is hosting such a big event.
Qatar has repeatedly said that it will be welcoming of all people, of all races, of all sexual orientations. And I think that a lot of the people here in Qatar know that this is a great opportunity for Qatar, who have seemingly been in the shadows for a really long time.
But there are, of course, Qataris who remain in the shadows.
I would like my existence not to be illegal in this country. I would like something that would say that I can be gay and not worry about being killed.
Aziz is gay in a country where homosexuality is against the law. He couldn't meet in person and needed his face and voice disguised on a video call.
The law's on your side when you're outside of Qatar. If somebody attacks you, you'd go to the police station. You would be protected. Whereas here, if something happens to me, I'll get blamed.
Zainab now lives here in the UK, but even then she's also worried about revealing her identity because of possible repercussions for family back in Qatar. She, like Aziz, says she thought about suicide. For her, it was the so-called guardianship rules for women that had an impact.
For every single major life decision, you require the explicit written permission from a male guardian. And if you don't get that permission, you cannot take that life decision, whether it's enrolling at university and studying abroad, traveling, getting married, or even getting divorced.
Zainab says she feels many Qataris look at women's rights somehow being a Western idea that clashes with Islamic values. Within decades, energy reserves turned Qatar's population from among the poorest in the world to the richest. For all the technological advancements, society is based on a traditional tribal system, one that remains religiously very conservative. Some of those negatively affected by the current laws told us they worried a successful World Cup could make it even less likely that Qatari society will change. Lee Makboul, BBC News.
Well, as the build-up to the tournament itself continues, the England and Wales squads are taking part in their first training sessions today after arriving in the capital Doha last night. They play their first games on Monday. Let's go to our correspondent Alex Howell, who's at the England training camp just south of Doha. Alex.
Hi Ben, yes, I'm here live at the England training camp, which is next to the team hotel in a more remote part of Doha. The team arrived here last night and Wales got here in the early hours of this morning. Although they're both preparing for games on the same day as they're in the same group, their schedules are slightly different. Wales have gone to a community event locally to where they're staying to meet some local children, and when England landed I actually got to speak to Captain Harry Kane, and he was speaking to me about how strange this build-up is for a World Cup. It's such a short period of time, but the excitement is there. Today is the first day of training. As you can see, the pitch behind me is where they'll be preparing for that game on Monday against Iran in just 5 days' time, and that's the same day that Wales take on the USA, and they will have to deal with the heat. It's very warm here, it's 32 degrees, and Gareth Southgate only has those 5 days to get his messages across to their players. But of course, there's a lot of excitement because it's a World Cup. But in 13 days' time, all eyes will be on this group when England and Wales take each other on in what could be the group decider.
OK, Alex, thank you very much indeed. Alex Howell there. OK, let's look at the weather forecast for you now. Here's Thomas Schaffernacker. Hiya, Thomas.
And umbrellas at the ready. It's been pretty wet so far this November. There's more rain on the way, and it will be quite windy at times too. Now, the temperatures over the coming days will ease a little bit, but so far this month it's been around 4.3 degrees above the average for the time of the year, which is pretty staggering. Now, this is the jet stream pattern, and notice this weather system here kind of stalls across parts of the UK over the next few days, the next 3 days or so. What does that mean? Well, that means there will be a lot of rain, and particularly across eastern areas. Now, everybody's going to get at least some rain, almost everybody. This is the rain scale there in millimetres. Notice that eastern Scotland, parts of northeastern England and Yorkshire are sort of in the greens there. That indicates around 80 millimetres of rain, but for many of us it will be pretty wet. So here's that weather system that's approaching us right now. It will reach the southern counties through the course of this afternoon. Also some heavy showers and really strong winds in the Northern Isles. So let's have a look at the forecast then from lunchtime onwards. Here's that low pressure that will be eventually stuck over us for a few days. It's approaching the south and the southwest. Elsewhere, actually, the weather isn't too bad. We've got some sunny spells, occasional showers, but very strong winds and heavy showers in Shetland, for example. Here, gusts of wind could be exceeding 70 miles an hour through the course of today. So tonight, we've got heavy rain in eastern Scotland, and then this area of low pressure sweeps in. Very strong winds in the Channel and along the Channel coast, particularly for the Channel Islands, actually. And you can see this low pressure parks itself around East Anglia and spreads the rain in other parts of the country, or two other parts of the country. 2 degrees in the lowlands of Scotland, 9 degrees in the south, so a bit of a nip in the air for some of us, but not all that cold. And now this low, once it's established here around East Anglia, parts of Lincolnshire, this is where it's going to stay through the rest of the week and through much of the weekend as well. Now, Northern Ireland actually isn't looking too bad at all tomorrow. You can see some sunshine there. So that was Thursday. This is Friday. That low pressure is still here. Now you can see the winds are blowing off the North Sea, pushing in the rain clouds towards parts of the Pennines and also eastern Scotland. That's why we're going to get a lot of rainfall here, and that's why, for example, southwestern England and southern Wales will get away with it. There'll be some sunshine around. And into the weekend, I suspect if you want some bright weather, the south is the place to be, especially southwestern areas. Elsewhere, it'll be wet. Back to you.
Thomas, thank you very much indeed. And that is all from the BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One Now, we'll join the BBC's news teams where you are. Have a very good afternoon.